Hello everyone, my name is Vipul and I lead co-marketing for VWO, a full funnel experience optimization platform. Our first master for tonight had confirmed to me in writing that he did not direct Inception, neither Interstellar, but he has helped in growing the organizations that he has worked for. Join me in welcoming Christopher Nolan, the head of growth at Shipbob, an end-to-end fulfillment solution for e-commerce businesses. Hey Chris, thanks for presenting this session.
Hey Vipul, thanks for having me, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Perfect. I'm glad to have you here as well. So yeah, before I hand over the mic to Chris, I just wanted to inform everyone that we have a dedicated 10 minutes allocated for a Q&A section at the end of this session. So for all you curious minds, if you have any questions or any doubts, please feel free to post your questions in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar. So with that, I think it's the appropriate time to pass on the mic to you, Chris.
Great, thanks again, and once again, thank you all for showing up. I know it's hard to make time on a Wednesday morning, but it's very much appreciated, and I hope you find value with this. So without further ado, let's jump in. Insights beyond the primary KPI. So how do you leverage those test results that are deemed bad or failures or just don't drive business in the way that you expect? My name's Chris. I'm here to guide you through this. LinkedIn profile on the left, main goal, main focus is growth and has been for my entire career. I've worked across B2B, B2C companies in agency life and really had a focus on B2B SaaS for the last 3 or 4 years. So a lot of the examples in this presentation will focus on the latter, but there's a ton of insight here for really any industry. Currently, I'm head of growth over at Shipbob, as Vipul mentioned, and outside of work, you'll probably either find me on a bike or eating somewhere that has plates that are too small that costs too much money. A quick overview of the presentation. Goal is really to do 3 things, right? Build that foundation for your tracking and reporting on A/B tests, so that you can have confidence in reporting internally, externally to a leadership group within your own team, wherever you need that confidence in the data. It's building that foundation for that. I'm calling it a track stack. It's a bad pun, but I went with it. 2, how do you analyze your test results once you have that foundational reporting and confidence in your data? And then 3, like I said, how do you communicate that out? And then really wanted to touch on other uses for a good track stack beyond just A/B testing. Wanted to touch on what this doesn't include. This isn't going to be a walkthrough of how to set up Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, testing tools, right? There's documentation, and I've provided that within this presentation. It's not going to talk really about hypothesis creation or program strategy. Again, something I'm very passionate about, but this is focused more on that foundation for testing. It's not going to be an explicit recommendation for any testing tool. Just want to make that clear. And it doesn't intentionally include terrible jokes, but I, again, cannot guarantee that. So step 1, it's building that track stack, right? Building that foundation. There's really 3 components to any good basic testing setup. One, and it's required, is a testing tool. You can't test without some website experience manipulation. Y'all know the main purpose of that. It's to change the experience for the user and to allocate traffic accordingly to your control and whatever number of experiences you're manipulating. The 2 recommended tools for this track stack that I highly advocate for are an analytics tool and a tag management tool. Analytics is going to be used to measure your user behavior and site engagement. Most software companies or e-commerce companies will have some analytics set up. And then tag management is really just a developer-less code implementation software. So it allows you to do things like inject scripts and so much more beyond that we'll get through. But these are really the 3 foundational components of that testing tracking foundation. So if we look at what's required and what's recommended, I like to kind of look at pros and cons of the required versus kind of the aggregate all 3 component stack. With the testing tool, especially these days, you really can define and replicate goals and KPIs easily, right? Most testing tools require this before you can even launch a test. What's also really nice is that they spend a lot of time on visual reporting, right? And everyone knows the power of a chart in a good presentation. That's out of the box. And then finally, there's built-in statistical significance measurement, test duration recommendations, things that you just won't get if you're looking at raw data. So there is a ton of value in just leveraging the testing tool for results, but what it's limited by really is three main things. One, you can only track user-defined goals. So that means that you have to define a goal before a test in order for that goal to be tracked. You can only slice up your reporting in a number of ways. Now, again, I put an asterisk here because a lot of these tools are getting very savvy with how to segment and track with more customization. But at a basic level, you have device, you have source, and it's relatively predefined. So it's not non-existent, but it's limited. And then lastly, it's very difficult to backfill data beyond something like a page view. So if you have what I call like an aha moment, right? Hindsight's 2020, where it's like, well, I really should have been tracking this previous to launching this test. It's very difficult to do that with a standard testing tool. Right? And so that's the benefit of the combination of these three things. It's all of the pros of that testing tool by itself. Plus, you get access to all of the predefined goals that your business already has in existence with a web analytics tool, right? So you can look at the page views, the time on site, the source, right? Things that might be available in a testing tool, but you can also see things like, where did this user land before they made this conversion, right? What was the path that drove them into this testing experience? If you're testing on something that's not a landing page, oftentimes there's value in understanding how the user got to that test. There's a lot more flexibility with user-defined goals, and this is where the tag management comes into play. And again, we'll get much deeper into this. But you can implement things that are things like scroll tracking, link tracking, form field engagement, right? Things that are available in heat maps, scroll maps, a lot of really nifty technology, but not necessarily in a one-stop shop like in analytics, where you can take that data and cross-reference it with other conversion metrics that you're trying to understand. Now, that said, there are cons to this, and I want to be clear with that. This requires integration setup. With the testing tool, it's not easily replicable like a predefined goal would be within a test. So you have to set up typically a custom dimension within your analytics tool and within the testing tool. It's not a ton of work, but it can be cumbersome if you're testing across a lot of different experiences at once. There's more work required for that really clear visual test reporting that is incredibly valuable. So you have to do things like pull your data into a Google Sheets or an Excel and use the chart functionality there. There's no built-in statistical significance reporting, which can be difficult if you're trying to make quick decisions. That said, I have a ton of resources for A/B test calculators. Please feel free to reach out to me after the presentation and I can provide that. Test measurement, right? How do you set this up? Again, presentation not geared towards installation, but wanted to provide some value here. Testing tool, again, no recommendation there. Typically, you want to install this in the head of your site directly rather than through something like a tag manager. You can often implement directly with your content management system, your CMS, or you can hand it over to a developer if you have that resource and just have them install it. Best recommendation is very high up on the page. Web analytics, you can install directly on the site as well. You can install through your CMS, or you can leverage Google Tag Manager to install Google Analytics. And typically with Tag Manager, you can install it within your CMS. There's a lot of kind of plugins, defaults within most good CMSs like a WordPress or a Craft that will allow for this. This slide is indicative of how this presentation is going to look moving forward. A lot of links, a lot of text. Please don't feel obligated to read through every single word. I'm not going to speak through every single word. The intention of this is to share out a PDF version of this presentation so that you find value beyond this webinar. Again, similar theme here. If you want to integrate testing tools with Google Analytics, which I highly recommend, there are a couple of steps. Here's a couple integrations and links to that. And then in order to use this, you'll need to create those custom dimensions and segments. Don't get overwhelmed. It's a lot easier than it sounds. And there's really good documentation out there. I've linked to two of the ones that I really trust. All right, so that's building your foundation, right? That's step one. We've seen the importance and the benefits of kind of either or. Now, what does that bring to the value of your testing, right? That's kind of the crux of this presentation. So what I've done is I've brought in a couple real world examples from my experience. Number one, when I was at BigCommerce, my first job out of agency, we did a lot of testing on our pricing page. And so I'm going to pop out here because I know it's difficult to see. This was the control experience of our pricing page when I got there. And so that we have our 4 plans. It's a pretty standard SaaS pricing page. Annual benefits, features, right? Some calls to action beneath the feature set, and then really, a phone number call to action, some tech support, and FAQs. What we tested against was what I like to call a big swing, which I am in favor for. I don't completely advocate for isolated variable isolation A/B testing. It can be boring, and it doesn't always drive the value to the business that something like a redesign can drive, right? And so we took a big swing. We said, let's change the layout and the design. Let's actually add this monthly annual pricing as something more interactive. Let's bring the plan cards a little bit closer to their feature sets. Let's drastically reduce the length of the chart. Let's add in tooltips, right? Let's bring in some social proof and some more value and FAQs and consultant CTAs there. So there's a lot of changes on this page. And what we saw was not what we expected. 4% decrease in our main KPI, which was that trial conversion rate, the try it free, the main CTA at BigCommerce at the time. And then a 25% decrease in that demo conversion rate, that slightly up market call to action. And what else was the result of that? A pretty unhappy design team who busted their butts to get this out the door in time, and an executive team who'd waited on this test for that duration of time that it took the design and development team to build out. And now we're sitting here with what could be deemed a failed test, right? So this stinks, and this is going to happen if you're testing. And there's really 2 ways to go about it. One, you can say, great, let's scrap that page and let's just move forward with the control, and we'll see what we can test there. Is to dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, this test failed, but why, right? And so in order to look kind of beyond that main KPI, I really leveraged in this instance 3 pieces of data and a 4th that's not exclusive to this Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager setup. So I had installed scroll depth tracking. This is native to Google Tag Manager now, and I've included instructions there that pushes the depth of scroll in whatever percentages you'd like in 10%, 25%, 50%. I like to do 10% intervals into Google Analytics as an event. It's very nifty. You can look by variation at scroll depth at a very granular level. Similarly, I looked at element engagement, right? And so a lot of testing tools do really well with this, where you can basically point and click and you'll have tracking on an element as a goal. It's separate from your main goal. And so the challenge to that is that you can't necessarily say what effect or impact did that engagement with that element have on conversion. You can really just see differences in element engagement. And I'll get to why that's important in a second. And then navigation summaries. Honestly, if I were to recommend one native feature in Google Analytics to anyone who's getting started and trying to really crack their website open, it's navigation summaries. I've included an overview and I'll show you the value there, but it's something that I highly advocate digging deeper into and really leveraging that as one of the more valuable assets that Google Analytics provides. So what did we see? We saw that there's really no change in how many users scroll down to the bottom of that features chart. And we saw the massive shortening of that chart. And so that was a really interesting insight, right? We saw that users are scrolling regardless of how long we make that. They're looking to see all of the features and all of the plans before they make a decision, right? We also saw a massive engagement with our monthly toggle, right? So we previously had this little snippet, this little message that said 10% off, right? But when we show that value in real tangible numbers, it seems to really draw the user in. And what we saw, again, what's really important about this being in Google Analytics is that the higher scroll depth and the engagement with the annual and monthly toggle correlated to a higher trial conversion rate, right? So we could have seen in a heat map that scroll depth and toggle engagement were high, but KPIs were not met. and we could have deduced that those things are poor for conversion, but in reality, they were what were driving the conversions that did occur. Secondly, we saw that by device, there was a massive difference. Those aggregate results that I mentioned earlier, right, a negative conversion rate difference in both trial and demo, were in fact mostly due to desktop users. Mobile users had a 10% trial increase in conversion rate, right? And so why? Well, we saw that users on mobile, right, and I'll show you this in real time here, had much less scroll than users in desktop because we were able to implement different engagement tracking for this try it free versus this try it free. We were able to deduce that that bottom CTA engagement was what was really driving that value, right? And so lastly, we saw that the scroll on desktop was driving clicks on this very small call to action down here. And I'm sorry, my screen is blocking it, but there's this little payment processing link that says learn more. There you go. And we saw that in the control experience where that link existed, where we'd removed it from the variation, not thinking about it, users clicked on that at a very high rate and were 2 times more likely to convert than users who didn't. And it's this tiny link on the bottom left, right? And so in order to figure this out, I created a sequence segment, right? I looked at navigation summaries to understand how many users clicked on this, and then I created a sequence segment for users who went from the pricing page to this payments page. And then I looked at conversion rate within that sequence segment. Again, sounds complicated. I've linked to how easy this truly is, and found that, again, conversion rate was massive. And so we take these 3 insights, right? 1, mobile users like this new scheme. 2, the payments link is incredibly important. And 3, the monthly toggle is driving conversion. Now, that said, we don't really have evidence to suggest that, the new layout is driving better conversion. We don't have evidence to suggest that a truncated feature set on desktop is driving conversion, right? But what we did was we kind of backtracked and said, let's take the control, right? And let's see how we can take these insights and build it into a V2 of our original test, right? So you can see how we did that. We revamped the design back to that kind of gray-white color scheme. We added in the monthly annual toggle down here on the left. We maintained the payment processing link, and then we actually kept the experience similar, though we did alter the design a little bit. And I think this is really important, and this is something that my mentors at my previous agency really advocated for. Don't be afraid of kind of that Frankenstein experience for mobile and desktop. You want a site to be responsive. You don't want it to break between experiences, but it's okay for a mobile user to have a different experience than a desktop user. Oftentimes, that's what really is going to drive your business forward in a way that you wouldn't expect. And when we tested this, don't want to bury the lead, 15% lift in trial conversion rate and a 45% lift in demo conversion rate. So, just to take a large step back here, we had a test that took, I don't want to put anyone under the bus here, 3 to 6 months of work, right? To design out, to QA, to develop, to get into a testing tool, to set up, to set proper expectations, to make sure we had stakeholder approval and product marketing, and then to launch. And at the end of it, we had negative results. And so to be able to take these insights that you glean from kind of that tag manager, analytics, testing tool ecosystem and say, look, let's not jump the gun here. Let's see why, and let's see if there's any benefit in what we all agreed was a better user experience, right? And so I really like that example as a real world example of how to take what anyone could comfortably call a failed test and move forward with it. And here's why it's so cool, right? Now I'm at Shipbob. We have a pricing page. It's not one-to-one. We're not pure SaaS, but it's a very similar, I guess, like website model, right? We have a free account creation with this get started now call to action, and we have an ability to talk to sales to request a quote. And so, I came in July, and the first thing that I looked at, based on my experience at BigCommerce, was our price. And I saw that our main call to action above the fold was get started now, right? It was that account creation. And then we had a link in what I kind of like to call no users land down here, and hanging out in the bottom right that led to requesting a quote. And you'll never guess what we found. 11% of all users on that page clicked on that tiny link, right? And that's fourth highest of any component on that page. That includes navigation, that includes login, that includes the main call to action. And we saw that users who clicked on that converted to quote at around 70%, right? So that's, if you think about it, around a 30% form abandonment rate on that quote, which is a lower abandonment rate than we typically see on our quote form. And so, using that insight that I gleaned from a failed test experiment previously, right, and bringing it to my new experience, there's only one test that can follow after this, right? It's testing the quote call to action in the kind of main CTA spot. And so that's what we did. We tested request a quote rather than get started now, and we saw that we had a massive lift, right? It was 104% increase in quote requests. As expected, a reduction in accounts created because we removed that as the main call to action, but on aggregate, it's a 31% lift. No one in their right mind is walking away from that. But as you should be skeptical of failed results, you should be equally skeptical of what seem like really good results. Sometimes it's not necessarily what you expect, right? So the first question that comes into my mind as kind of a seasoned skeptic is, was it actually the button, or were people just clicking on that link again, scrolling past the original thing? And that link is really what we need to promote on the page. It sounds silly, but you can answer it with link tracking, right? Again, Google Tag Manager has this native as a variable to set up, and I've linked to it. What it does, the way that I've set it up, is it pushes in every single link click on our site with the following event schema, right? So event category, links on links, forgive me, it is corny. Event action is whatever the text on that link is going to come through in Google Analytics as an event action. And so you can see that here in this screenshot, that the event category is that top link engagement category, right? And the event action is going to come through as this click text. And I like to put destination URL as the event label, because if there are, let's say, multiple learn more clicks or learn more links on your homepage, and you want to know which link was clicked, you might need that tertiary piece of data to say, oh, that's the learn more link that goes to the pricing, or the learn more link that goes to the features, right? And it's sometimes very important to distinguish. On this page, we only had one link that said fill out this form, so it wasn't necessary to dive deeper into that event label. And unsurprisingly, we found that request a quote button drove a substantial amount of conversions, as we'd expect, but people were still clicking on that link, right? And so a reasonable person could very much say, well, okay, cool, we added the CTA, it's working, get rid of that link, we don't need it down there, but it's still working, right? And so this to me is the benefit of even looking past the successful tests, because you want to maintain that lift, right? There's a joke in the A/B testing world where sometimes you see 4 or 5 positive test results. You go to the business and they're like, why are we down? Sometimes the reality of it is that test results don't correlate with strong business numbers. I mean, it's sometimes how it works. And so you got to do all you can to maintain the momentum of a successful test as you implement. And so it's really important to say, okay, not only did we fail, why, how can we respond, but also why did we win? And how can we be sure to implement that here and also across the rest of any similar page on our site, especially with things like landing pages. If you find a win on a landing page, take that template, start testing it across different campaigns, different channels. There's a ton of value in that. So that's, again, 2 real world examples for just communicating, or I'm sorry, just for being able to take a failed test or a successful test and look deeper and not just accept the result on its face. And I think there's a ton of value in that. What's next? You got to be able to communicate this, right? So this is advice from a seasoned loser. I can confidently say that I've lost more tests than I've won, and I'm still in business. I still get jobs. It's the reality of it. If you're testing with purpose, you're going to lose a lot. And so one of the things that you can do to kind of build your brand internally, if you're in-house or if you're in an agency and you're looking to build your brand with clients, sell confidence in the thoroughness of that data and your analysis, right? And so if you're working with folks who have that testing mentality, the test and learn mentality, they're going to be comfortable with the insight just as much as they're comfortable with immediate results, right? As you keep losing and you keep bringing insights, they're eventually going to get tired of that. But build the confidence in the fact that you can find meaningful insight from your tests before you're so concerned with every single test being a win, right? Similar to that, don't lie. I've had the instinct to be like, oh, maybe I can, slice and dice this data differently. No, be real. It's very cool that you found this tiny link is important to the business, but don't start with that, right? The agenda that I typically follow, and that's worked for me across internal, external presentations, is the hypothesis, why you think it's important, and your main key performance indicators. Take some screenshots of the variance, show the result with the main KPI, and then if you have insight beyond, go ahead and bring that in, and then talk about next steps. Right? Everyone wants to know. Okay, cool. We saw all this. What's next? One of the things that I've really found valuable and that a mentor of mine highly advocates for is linking to your data. I think there's a ton of value in that, right? So especially to begin with, if you have this Google Analytics data, you've pulled it into an Excel spreadsheet, maybe it's raw, maybe it's messy, link to it, right? That's going to give confidence that you're not pulling these numbers out of somewhere that's not precise. Similarly, don't be afraid to show the methodology, especially for the CPOs, the CTOs in the room. They want to know, okay, cool, like you're tracking links. How are you doing that? Or how on earth are you tracking scroll depth at a quantitative level? I often do this in either the results or insights section of my test decks. And then really importantly here, we're talking about very granular sampling and leveraging really, really granular data to get to these conclusions. In Google Analytics, it will often sample the data. You have to be really careful with this. Do not report on that. If you have a yellow check mark in the top left corner of any of your analyses, just take a note of it. If you do have Google Analytics 360, you can pull an unsampled report. If you have the free version, my recommendation is to either reduce the complexity or just remove your segment and use it for directional data for your own purposes, or reduce the date range. Typically, things over a month are going to sample when you're segmenting heavily. If you keep it to maybe week by week and aggregate that data, you'll have more of a chance of that data not being sampled. And lastly, again, not going to go through all of this, just really want this to be valuable beyond the presentation. Here are some of the things that I use Google Tag Manager for in my current role, and it's some of it's superfluous, but a lot of it has really brought value, especially form field engagement. If you're in an e-commerce site or you're working on direct response landing pages, form field engagement is massive. It'll tell you where in the form people are dropping off, not just that they're leaving your page, and that's incredibly valuable insight. And then here's some basic recommendations for Google Analytics. One thing I would focus on here, navigation summaries. If you have the time to really spend digging into your nav summaries, you will find value. I guarantee it. It's my first stop whenever I go into Google Analytics, and I go into Google Analytics a lot. I know that I didn't really have a chance to speak to e-commerce in this, like I said. So I've included some insights for e-commerce companies. I've included it. It's in the PDF version of this. Apologies for not mentioning on it right now, but just want to clearly reiterate that the value of this webinar is not necessarily exclusively in this presentation. I want all the attendees to be able to take this, take it back to their business, and use this over time.
Perfect. That was quite an insightful presentation, Chris. Not everyone actually talks about failures that openly, but and I appreciate that you shared examples of such failed experiments and how you were able to drive insights from even the failed experiments and took it to your leadership and they took it well. So that's really a commendable effort, I would say. So yeah, I think it's a good time that we can now move on to the question and answer section. So Mark is asking, a high-level takeaway here could be that even if your test failed, you may be able to find some nuggets of data or hope in the results. What if you don't? Do you keep digging?
That's a really good question, Mark. There's a point in time where all rabbit holes need to be come back up from. I think that you dig until you have looked at what you feel confident in. And sometimes a failed test is just a failed test. If you can say, look, I looked at scroll depth, there's really no difference that gleans insight. I looked at call to action engagement, similar. I looked at form field engagement. Nothing here screams out why this test is a loser. It's just a poor experience, right? And I think there's still value in communicating that. I gave it all that I have. That's reasonable, and there's no reason to get stuck on this test if we can't find meaningful insight to move forward from. So sometimes you do have to scrap a test.
Right. I hope you got the answer, Mark, there. Char Kandeva, I'm sorry, Char, if I pronounced your name incorrectly. So Chad is asking, in terms of collecting data, would you recommend us to go through video recordings, or should one just focus on the data getting in from Google Analytics or Tag Manager?
So I think video recordings are valuable. I think heat mapping and scroll mapping are also valuable. I think what they do is they give you a place to look, right? And what you have with your track stack or your setup in Google Analytics is an ability to say, okay, looks like 3 out of 10 users were, leaving this page before, they took the action that we desired. Is there something more there, right? Or it looks like tons of people are scrolling past our main call to action and are clicking on reviews, right? What is the conversion rate of those folks who click on reviews? And so it basically gives you a segment of folks to further analyze. I still think there's tons of value in video recording, and I leverage it internally. It's a good question.
Right. Makes sense. I think as much data as you can get, the better it is, right? The video recording will definitely give you more qualitative understanding of what's really happening, while Google Analytics will tell you more quantitative, insight. So I think if you are able to mix both of them, if you're able to derive insights from both of them, I think it will give you more clarity there. Right. So
Completely agree.
Rishi Rawat is asking, okay, that's an important question. That's a good question. How important it is to retest a test winner?
That is an excellent question. And here's what I would say. Before you run any tests with any testing tool, run what I would call an AA test, right? So run a test where you do nothing to manipulate, and I'm using finger quotes here, your variation. And just be sure to calibrate the tool with your site, right? It's just like if you're using a cooking thermometer, right? And you have the same temperature of water and you put the thermometer in one and it says, 50, you put in the other, it says 75. It's not an accurate measurement tool, right? And so I would say first, have confidence in the testing. Secondly, be comfortable with retesting, but maybe throw in a third variation, right? So, hey, this just doesn't make any sense. I changed the call to action from like, don't click this button to, click me for free, and it still didn't win. Well, maybe test, try us free, and maybe just keep going down that road, right? There are, especially with smaller sample sizes, there are false positives and there are false negatives. That's the reality of testing. And so if you run into a situation where you still have a lot of confidence in your hypothesis and the data that you've gathered suggests that that's a good test, there's no harm in retesting. Just be sure that you have confidence in the testing tool before you do that.
Right. And I think, it's as important to test the winner as it is important to test the failures. And that makes the entire testing process a very iterative process. So you have to keep doubting yourself. You have to keep doubting the numbers that you're getting and keep iterating on them. So that's the best way in terms of getting what the in understanding basically what the customer is trying to say, or what the visitor is trying to say in terms of building a better experience. So yeah, thanks again for the great question, Rishi, and thanks, Chris, for answering it smartly. The next question is from Brandon. Brandon is asking, at what point do you determine that you need to turn back and refine your initial hypothesis to retest?
So that's a really good question. I would say if you have, I typically look at a threshold of like 100 conversions per variation. If you've reached 100 conversions per variation and you don't have any data that suggests anything is a strong win or loss, then maybe it's time to reevaluate the hypothesis. Now, again, with smaller sample sizes, don't wait for 100 if you're getting 2 or 3 conversions a day, right? I would wait 2 to 3 weeks, check back in, see if anything's changed. And if not, maybe it's time to go back. But typically either 100 conversions per variation or, 2, 3, 4 weeks.
Okay. I hope you got the answer, Brandon. So yeah, so there's one question that's coming from Brian Macy. So Brian Macy is asking, how does this apply to the STD testing sites?
That's awesome. I used to work for one of my agency clients was an STD testing site. So it applies very, very directly. I would say, in my experience, things like, seeing how many users. Here's my experience to answer your question directly. When I was working in that space, there were a lot of complaints of people who had scheduled a test and expected it to be delivered to their home, right? And this business model was you schedule a test and you go to the doctor where you had your test scheduled. And so we tested making users select a location before they could even get into the checkout. And we saw that we had reduced number of users in the checkout, but we had a higher conversion rate in that checkout. And using the form field engagement, we saw that users who engaged with the form in checkout, once we showed them the map, were like 3 or 4 times more likely to complete it because they were fully aware of what it entailed. So I think there's a ton of value for this. I think especially with form field tracking on checkout, especially with things like engagement with scroll, if you have something that says, in order to by ordering this service, you should expect blank, blank, and blank. And you know how far down the page that is, and you know that only 30% of people are seeing that, well, then maybe you need to move that up the page, right? So I have a lot of hypotheses actually in the STD testing space because I was an agency partner for one of them for probably a year and a half, but I use this very often in that space.
Right. Great. I hope you got the answer, Brian. So one thing, Chris, that I have to highlight from this entire presentation is your passion for tracking and testing in particular. So I'm just curious to know what makes you passionate about testing and tracking.
Yeah, I mean, everyone loves testing, right? Everyone I've ever met in any business is curious about A/B testing, and I think what people often miss is what the more granular tracking from the wins and losses can mean for the entire business. And so I'm passionate about extrapolating out what seems like very innocuous or granular data points to answer more complex questions in the business. And so I think there's a ton of value there. I studied psychology in school, which doesn't seem like the necessary corollary there, but the psychology that I studied was very methods forward. And so everything we did had to be rigidly studied, rigidly measured, and you couldn't deduce a valid or invalid hypothesis without first establishing the foundation for that experiment. And I think there's a ton of value in applying, a scientific method to testing. And so that's really what got me into it. I think tracking is a complement to all of that. And once you start digging into really how granular you can get with tracking, sometimes, like, I admit it, I go overboard. I track way too much stuff that maybe I use, once a quarter, but it's nice to have. And I always just go back to that hindsight 2020 in my experience. And, it's been a while that I've been in this space. It's always better to be like, yes, I do have the answer to that seemingly tangential question rather than having to say no, but I'll set it up so that I can answer your question next time. Right. So I think that's really the value of this, is having this robust tracking environment and ecosystem where you have confidence that you can answer the question that any stakeholder in your business is going to ask.
Right. And that makes sense, because when you have these answers are not just opinions, right? These are based on true data that you have seen, that you have tracked, and that basically helps you in coming forward as a person who has done the research, who knows what he's saying particularly. So that is a plus as well. So I'm actually touched by the passion that you carry, and would love to absorb some part of that as well. So the second question that I had was regarding one of your in one of your slide, and I think other examples that also that you've shared. You mentioned that there was a 4% decrease on some on BigCommerce, right? On BigCommerce's pricing page, right? So once you run a test, you invest a lot of effort and time into it, and the test does not give you the result that you were expecting, or maybe went a little bit on the negative side. So when you take these numbers to your leadership, right? How, like, what is their reaction? How does the leadership actually react to those numbers, and how do you personally think the leadership should take these insights?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it gets back to one of the previous questions about, what do you do if you've dug and dug and dug and you're still failing? I think, it very much depends on who you're presenting to. I've worked in, like I said, a lot of different businesses and a lot of different stakeholders, and some embrace the value of testing, embrace that a loss, is not only going to happen, but it's probably going to happen often. And some, expect the person that they're paying an agency fee to, you know, to deliver immediately. And so there's really not a blanket answer. I would say, you have to, this is the theme, right? Have the confidence in your results, have the conviction in your original hypothesis, right? And accept the failure, and have that next step, right? So have if you have a failed test and you've dug, then you say, okay, I've dug. Next step, we're going to go back to the drawing board, right? And here's a couple of the other hypotheses that I had for this set of pages or page or checkout. And we're just going to keep going down the list, right? I think that a good leader or a good stakeholder in this space values the learning side of testing, but in reality, that's not always going to be the case. So I would say go in with conviction, go in with confidence in your data, accept accept the criticism of the result. Don't necessarily accept. You don't have to push back, obviously, to leadership, but don't accept the criticism of the hypothesis. Just say, yeah, you're right. It's a failed hypothesis. That's why we test. And our next one is, this, and we have a lot of confidence in this. And here's why.
Right, right. That makes sense. The criticism should be taken well, and not with a pinch of ego or something. So yeah, that's a great advice for all the leaders who might be listening or who would be listening it in the future. Right. So there's again another question from Mark. So he's referring back to one about your comment on 100 conversions or 2 weeks. Do you remember this speaking, Chris?
Yeah. So that's like the threshold for
Right.
when
So
you.
he's asking, what if I get 10,000 conversions and 500,000 visits a day? Can I
Yeah.
trust that something is statistically significant in 24 hours? Or do we get into the realm of false positives?
So, okay, Mark, now I know what you're working with. So I used to work for a motorcycle parts vendor, and there was similar numbers, and tons of conversions a day, tons of traffic. Um, I would say wait 2 weeks. I would say, make sure that you're giving time for the variation to really play out and the control to play out. Now, that said, if you're a week in and you're seeing 140% lift in your variation, or worse, as a business stakeholder, 100% loss, cut it, right? And I would say be healthily skeptical of the positives. Let those run because it's not hurting the business. If you need to cut the cord on the negatives, cut the cord. No one's going to get mad at you for that. And maybe come back and test it later on with that kind of traffic. I mean, you can be testing, 4 or 5 tests a month. So I would say if positive and stat sig has been reached and held for at least a day or two beyond the initial launch of the test, go ahead and be comfortable with that, and then monitor. This is the value of Google Analytics too. If you have an annotation, go ahead and annotate in Google Analytics. This is when I launched that test, and have all of the traffic allocated to it within the testing tool, right? And then look back at it in a week. And if you see the performance isn't as you'd expect, right, then go ahead and revisit. That's what I typically do is I say, okay, if it's high volume, high traffic, we have a win. Let's draw a line in the sand here, let all traffic go to it and see if that mean is consistent, right? And if not, then maybe we revisit it. If we do see consistent lift, as we'd expect, go ahead and implement or, take it out of the testing tool and hard code it, however you see fit to make that experience more consistent for your users. But that's a really good question. I've worked in that space as well, and it's really exciting, but it's also really easy to draw conclusions very quickly. So I would say, be responsible to the business, and then be skeptical of the lift.
Right. I hope you noted that all of that down, Mark. That's some really great advice there from Chris. Great. I'm sorry, Chris, we went a bit over time, but this is such an interesting session that I just have one more question for you. Right.
Totally.
So I just wanted to understand, do you have a team at ShipBob or did you have a team at BigCommerce that helped you in the entire optimization effort?
So, I mean, it was more or less a one-man band, right? So I had at BigCommerce, there were passionate designers who I could rely on to design out good experiences. There were, passionate web developers who I could rely on for JavaScript, but oftentimes I was relying on the tool. And sometimes you need to pull in, the data analysts, you need to pull in the designers, you need to pull in the web developers, you need to pull in the stakeholders, you need to pull in the product marketers for messaging, right? All of this, there's an ecosystem to testing. I don't want to discourage people from being a one-man band or a one-woman band and getting in there and testing yourself and leveraging some of the capacities that a testing tool might provide in terms of resources for things like data analytics and design and development. Yeah, typically there is a whole testing ecosystem. However many people exist within that ecosystem is up to your business and up to how much they, provide resources to it. But it's a lot of hats. It's a lot of hats to wear.
Right, right. And then sometimes, if a single person is handling all the things, it might become overwhelming. So for some organizations,
Exactly.
of course, it's better if you, start building a team and, take the optimization program forward. So that also reminds me to also include uh, about the next session that we're going to have next week. CG Bessison, he is the head of optimization at HSBC. Of course, doesn't need any introduction. So he will be sharing insights on how to build an optimization team, how he was able to build an optimization team at HSBC. So that's going to be a really great session. I'll just drop the link to register for that session here. So you guys can just go ahead and register for it and have a look at it. It's going to be a great session again next week, 11 December. So yeah, Chris, I invite you as well to attend the session by CG and ask the questions.
No, of course.
Perfect. So I think that's it for today. Thanks again, Chris, for a wonderful and such an insightful session. I'm sure the audience must have loved it too. Don't forget to register for the next session, and we'll meet next week. Thanks again, and have a great day, guys.
Great. Thank you all, and thank you for putting this all on Bibble. Appreciate it.